Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for being a patron. I know I said I'd do a Q&A quite a while ago on YouTube, and then I kind of thought, as you're going to find out, like, I'm not that interesting, and maybe I'll just waste your time rather than waste the time of the good general public who don't donate money to me. It's really strange to have finally made what feels to me like a significant move into territory where now this is beginning to become a bit of an income, and it's beginning to become something that's more like a job and not so much a hobby. And that's great. And it's also giving me the time and giving me the reason and the motivation to now put more effort, I think, into my Patreon offerings, which I'm going to be doing, from now on. Also, I'm going to be upping the speed with which I release YouTube videos. You should be seeing a few new ones coming up quite soon. There's not going to be 3-month gaps anymore, I hope. So I said I was going to do a Q&A a while ago, and I got quite a few questions back in, I think it was January, and then the second time I said it, which was late March. So I'm now looking through a lot of those questions, which are all from patrons, and I'm going to answer those first, and then we'll do a second Q&A. Right, so I've written them all down here, and I've also got little bullet points to remind me what I think my answers are going to be, and I'm going to keep turning over to look at it, if you don't mind. Okay, I think a good one to start with is from Alistair Seeley. Alistair Seeley, I feel confident that that's how to pronounce your name. Your questions are, what is your name? My name's Tantacruel. What is your quest? My quest is to make music, to make software that lets people write music. What is your quest? And also, I like to talk about music on the old YouTube channel. That's my quest. What are your thoughts on open source projects in general, and has that changed at all since working on MuseScore? I worked for a company called Canonical on the Ubuntu mobile operating system back around 2012, and that was my first introduction to the open source world. It's funny because in that company, yes, they had open source contributors, but the vast majority of the work was done in-house by people who were hired. And that's sort of that funny place that some open source projects get to, where they become financially viable and then they're able to hire people to come in and work on it professionally. So some companies, or at least some projects, and I would put the Ubuntu mobile project into this category, are ones that aren't really open source. Like, yes, you can get the code, it's free. So yes, they are open source, but the community aspect isn't there, and it's really just a professional endeavor. And I've seen that twice, once in Ubuntu, again in Microsoft. Maybe some of you might not know, but I've worked for Microsoft for the last 5 years, and I quit to join MuseScore. At Microsoft, there was, for a small period, I worked on the HoloLens, which is that augmented reality headset. That has an open source community for its interface and for its patterns and controls. Some of it's contributed to by Microsoft. Some of it is just done for free by people who are enthusiasts or who are building their own projects. I had those two experiences before coming to MuseScore. And in both cases, it's very obvious that when a project starts getting popular, and especially when it starts bringing in money, there becomes this tension, I would say, between the what's going on internally, what's going on between the people who are hired professionally, who do call the shots to a certain extent about things like when releases happen. I guess my attitude towards open source software was, I always saw that tension existed. I say tension, I don't necessarily mean that there's tension between people. I just mean that organizationally it can be a bit tricky, because let's say you want to change the design of an entire interface. Well, some people are working on that for free and they've put an enormous amount of effort into it. And if you're going to change stuff that they did, you get into a weird potential crisis, I guess, because you might be changing the work that was contributed by someone and they might not agree with that change. And then that can be upsetting, so you need to handle that carefully. And I find the way you handle it is just by being reasonable and helping out. If someone is working on something and you want it to be good, you make sure you contribute to it to make it good. There are also, just bear in mind that there are so many open source projects, and there are a million different flavors. You have ones that are built to be open source because it's strategically useful to do that. The most obvious one is Android. Android is pretty solid in how it's handled, and clearly it's a team of professionals making it. But then there are ones that are solidly community based, and then they work on a community ethos, and it's a little bit like a democracy. MuseScore is very much a 50-50, where I'm not even a 50-50. In terms of the amount of people working on it, the community definitely outnumber the internal team. But the open source world is completely different from project to project. The organization is different, the motivations are different, and some are run really well and some are run quite poorly. I would say you're right. It is exactly what you said. It's a complete hodgepodge. But like the proprietary world, some are good and some are bad. MuseScore is definitely one of the good ones. The best one actually that I've worked in, and I've seen 3 open source jobs in my time as a designer. Okay, so next up is Stan Hammer. Stan Hammer says, "Now, I am perfectly aware that explaining a joke is much like performing an autopsy on a frog in biology class. However, I only learned that the above was based on an actual poem because I googled it before writing this message." Stan is referring to my Sibelius rant, where at the very end I have a little poem. So Stan Hammer is asking, what is my system for coming up with humor in my videos and how do I make my jokes? Okay, so with jokes, it's a funny one because I feel I need to be really loose and not try to force things. I think that's just the first thing I have to say is I have like a rule, which is I have loads of jokes written into my scripts, but I chop out about maybe 50 of them. I chop out 50 jokes. I chop out 50% of jokes because they're just not working or they're forced. And the worst thing you can do is force a joke. I think I'm naturally a person who likes to joke around and be silly and facetious about everything I speak about. And all my friends know this about me. When I'm working on a script, often something will just pop into my head as I'm going through it, as I'm doing my research. And the ones that I like the most are the ones that like don't even look like there's a proper genesis for them. It's a stream of consciousness that completely veers off the topic. They happen spur of the moment, but they don't come fully formed. So, for example, I was doing the corporate music video, which really was a video where I wanted to have a lot of fun. And there was that moment where I'm talking about nothing happening in the story of the music. And just at that moment when I was writing those words in the script, I thought, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall. And that was how I thought of the original joke, that it would be a little bit like the typewriter in The Shining, where she lifts up the paper and she just sees the same thing written over and over again. That was sort of how I thought about that joke initially. And then I left it and I came back to it later. And the idea of, wouldn't it be funny actually to just do an illustrative drawing of Humpty Dumpty in that sort of old style and to actually just show it as if that was the real story. Humpty Dumpty sat in the wall, he's continuing to sit in the wall. But then, go away you. But then I realized that that's boring. It's not a very good joke. So I needed to take that somewhere too. So I went back to the script and I just went, what would happen next? What would happen next? And I thought, oh, well, there was this bully who used to sit in my back garden. He didn't bully me, but he was a bully. He was a well-known bully. And he used to sit in our back garden on the wall looking in at us while we were having our breakfast. I'm serious. This is actually a kid who used to do this. I don't know why he was always up so early. So I'd look up and I'd see this kid on the wall and it kind of unsettled me because it's a very unsettling thing for a kid to do. And by the way, it was a very tall wall. So he'd be perching, kicking his legs back and forth, sort of happily looking at me while I ate my breakfast. And I just thought, that's what I want Humpty to do. I want to make it about me looking out at Humpty and he's just sitting on the wall and he won't go away. So I just thought, that's really funny. Let's do that. And that's how the jokes come. Sometimes they come randomly and I find a way to make them funny or I don't, and then they get thrown away. Then there are other types of jokes that I tell, like the Jankman joke, which is just the entire idea of Jankman taking over the ending of the Darko video. That was the plan before I even started writing the script. It came to me and I thought, that's going to be a funny way for that script to go. And the actual content, the comedy that's in there, whether or not you find it funny, that happens sort of on the fly. So sometimes sometimes it's random, sometimes it's really pre-planned. Again, the Shostakovich joke in MuseScore, I had that planned so long in advance. Where is that? I don't have it with me. So yeah, I try to stay loose with humor. I don't try to force it in. If it's not there, it's not there. And if it is there, tease it out. It's a little bit like writing music. Just see what's there. It's hard to describe. It really is. Ralph Wasp. Ralph Wasp asks, what is better, doing art for art's sake and have a job to support you, or being able to live from your art, but then have the need to deliver on a regular basis. So I guess the thing there is there's every variety of artist and they all have different motivations. So some artists really do think about their artwork as something that's for them and it's a creative outlet and that's why they do it. That's a very different type of motivation, and I couldn't give advice to those kinds of people because it's not exactly why I do it. I do it because I love sending stuff out into the world. I think that there should be, speaking just for myself, a bit of a split. Where the split lies is sort of up to each individual person, but for me, I wouldn't want to stop working as a designer, but I'd like to take it from what it is at the moment to a little less, quite frankly, and be doing a lot more music and a lot more YouTube off the back of that music. I don't know if I could tell you what's better. Being an artist is like a personality type. There's just a bazillion different types of artists with their own motivations, so each to their own, I guess. I just couldn't give you a definitive answer on that. I apologize. Thing I'd say about having to deliver on a regular basis, like, that's a problem. I mean, if you're, I mean, you don't want to get Arthur Conan Doyle, where people just expect the same content from you over and over again, and that's a trap, and you shouldn't, as far as I'm concerned, don't allow that trap to happen. Don't put yourself in a position where you have to keep churning stuff out all the time, and that's where, weirdly, having another source of income can actually free you, because, and I guess this is why you asked the question, it can free you if you're able to take enough time to actually work on what you want to work, and that's satisfying for you as an artist or for other people taking in your artwork. Yeah, it's just not letting it take over, and that's the thing. Generally speaking, when you have a job, it likes to try and take over. So it's a very difficult one. It's difficult for everyone in the world to try and balance that, you know. Florian, oh no, I'm going to get your name wrong. I'm so sorry. Florian Seginger. I'm so sorry. Florian S. Do you know the works of Igor? If so, what do you think of his music as a composer? All right, so let's do a bit of Igor. Oh, look, I got a new patron. So shout out to my new patron, Aaron Zeng. You're literally becoming my patron as I'm doing a video for my patrons. So welcome to you. Right, I have been listening to Igor. This is the kind of stuff that will go down really well, I think, in a composition class. From going to study in a conservatoire, we had a thing called gramophone where we'd all come in and we'd sort of bring in music that we liked. This kind of music will come in all the time. The composers just have a love of operatic, harmonically interesting metal, I think. So coming from a punk background and you know, sort of a heavy hard rock or whatever background myself, you know, this is just completely listenable for me. I have no issues listening to this, and I'll happily throw it on in the background. It's weird in that I wrote a few notes about it. Hold on. I was trying to get to the bottom of how I think you'd describe it. Not that that's a particularly important thing to do, but so it's, yeah, I wrote, it's a mix of metal, classical performance, gothic or grotesque harmony, I would say, cool audio manipulation and kind of electroacoustic stuff, so a lot of chopping in and out, samples of people singing, so a lot of kind of production work going in over the top, and larger scale sort of musical drama. But the thing I find interesting about it is it still feels like a pop song, even though it's clearly developing on a different level to pop music. It's not just returning to the same material over and over again. It feels like it's rooted in the pop song and it's growing from a pop song. It doesn't feel like it's coming from a classical music world. It's not developing in the way a piece of classical music would develop, which I find kind of fascinating. And it's just an observation I had. It's not a judgmental observation. It's just another interesting way of doing development. But it feels like instead of harmonic development where themes gradually change, although there's a bit of that, it's more like you keep getting introduced to new hooks and new types of chorus. That's the way I think about it. And then I still have this sense while I'm listening to it that I'm listening to bits of verses and bits of choruses, but just lots of different ones. That's why I think it feels rooted in the pop song. Anyway, that's what I think of Igor. No issues with Igor. Ezra Petri asks, I second this. Igor is great. Thanks, Ezra. Hayden Taylor says, what would the ultimate music notation software look like? I had to write down notes about this. Let's see if I can ream them off right now. and then I'll check my notes in a second. So first off, I really think it needs to be easy to use and actually fun to use. That's the issue with all the other notation programs at the moment. But if you look at the DAWs out there, I keep calling them DAWs. If you look at the DAWs out there, or if you look at the some of the more recent graphic design or interface design programs like Figma that have come out, they're fun to use. They're enjoyable. They're satisfying, you know? Whereas Sibelius just feels like... Sibelius is probably the most satisfying of the bunch, weirdly. I mean, Dorico can be satisfying in its own right, but they all feel quite old in the way that they handle their interactions. They haven't taken on board any of the things that modern DAWs do, apart from the fact that, let's say, Overture and Dorico and Notion have their own DAW sort of interface in there. But they don't take advantage of things like the interface elements that allow you to chop and change and experiment with musical ideas before you put them into your music, for example. This is something I'm working on right now. I think that a notation program should have a lot of those kind of widgets or components that allow you to try ideas out quickly, to chop and change harmony, to experiment with polyrhythm or additive rhythm or microrhythms just really quickly, like test ideas out, see if they work, rather than having to copy and paste them in bars all the time and then listen back and then, oh, I'm not happy with that, delete it all and start again. I also think that there really needs to be a fully formed DAW/notation program all in one, which has your proper VST support. I think it needs to have that sort of polish that Ableton and Reason have, so that when you're using it, it's just smooth and they've thought through all the different interactions, not just like really stilted and slow like Dorico is, or just completely lacking in features like Sibelius is. So like they need to start supporting properly stuff like aleatoricism or chants or interesting performance directions. Also like the whole electroacoustic aspect of modern music, where you're not just writing necessarily for acoustic instruments. Sometimes there's samples going on in the background all the time. In modern music this happens, and why is there still not a program that just lets you do that? Finale have something in there, but I don't know how it works. I literally tried yesterday to use it and it was just impossible. So I think that there needs to be the inclusion of proper audio and audio recording, a proper interface that allows you to work with film or with video clips. They're just too old-fashioned right now, and I think that they've been handled by people who think of classical music as a slog and as a chore, and it doesn't have to be. It can actually be a lot of fun. Is that going to continue? Another thing about notation apps I really would love to see more of are proper templates and style systems that allow people to just share them really quickly. Whenever I come to a notation app, the experience of trying to change the way it looks and just edit its layout so that it suits me is so hard in any of the applications. And even though like Sibelius has styles and MuseScore has styles, you can theoretically just take one from someone and plug it straight in. It's just hard to do and hard to find. And someone needs to take the time to actually think about that and think about how nice and enjoyable it would be. And another thing as well, I think that would be really great for an optimal notation program. The ideal would have cloud-based collaborative working. So for example, let's say in marching band, there might be more than one person putting together or arranging the music. It'd be nice to be able to work collaboratively on that. Another obvious one is if I'm a composer and I'm sending the music out to musicians, wouldn't it be nice if they could just quickly look at it, mark it up on, let's say, an iPad or something and go, I'm not able to play that. And rather than you needing to print out the scores all over again, you just get a notification on your notation program in the same way that you would with Google Docs. And you see a suggested recommendation and you go, hey, you know what, I'll do that. And you're all working from one document. This is the world we're in now. Notation programs are nowhere near catching up to that yet. And that's something else I think needs to happen too. And then the last thing I would say is they need to teach you more. They need to help you understand how music works and at least give you a bit of a heads up about how stuff works and just be a little bit more descriptive about, how you use this notation element and what is convention that you should use in this instance and stuff like that. I think Dorico clearly do the best job of that at the moment. But my ideal app would take that and take it a bit further. So that's it, I guess. That's a long enough answer. Okay, Rick Stoppa. I would love to learn more about 20th century and contemporary classical composition. How do I go about finding such teachers? Most of the teachers I've come across here in Turin are not that competent about anything besides 4-part writing and are hardly ever actual composers. That is a tough one, and I'd love to be able to tell you that if you get the right books, it'll sort you out. But the problem is, like, I was a composer who studied quite a lot of composition books before I went into the conservatoire. Like I remember I had David Cope's New Directions in Music, and I was reading Reginald Smith Brindle, I think his name is, his book on serial composition. Not certain what that book is called, but it should be easy enough to find. And they were really good. They were like, they educated you a lot about the methodology behind certain systems of writing. The problem is it doesn't teach you how to write. You know, it teaches you what a 12 note row is. It teaches you how different composers think about their music. But the problem about being a composer and trying to learn how to write music is you need to learn how you want to write. And that's one of the hardest parts about it. Like, you have ideas, but to begin with, you start by just copying things and you chuck stuff onto a page, and you need someone to look at what you've done after you've tried, after you've taken in all this information from books and from elsewhere, and go, what were you trying to achieve when you put that on the page? And what were you trying to achieve with this particular arrangement of instruments? Why did you do this stuff? And then you start asking yourself these questions. Well, what was my motivation here? What was I after? And then you'll just naturally discover, depending on the composition teacher, they might just point it out to you, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why is this happening? I just threw this in because I thought it was the right thing to do. And they kind of help you to understand, next time you do that, make it so that you don't feel you have to do it. Do what you think should happen, you know? And the thing is, even as I say this to you, that's itself not really good advice. You have to be looking at it from the point of view of music you've already written, that you've brought in, and that someone who has experience can look at and help you to understand yourself. Because the thing about music is, even though you're the one that wrote it, I think half the time you actually don't even understand what it is you've written. You don't understand half the time where the problems are with it, especially when you're a beginner, because it's just not obvious to you what problems are, and you can't see them yourself. You can't see your own issues. So teachers, what's necessary? Thinking practically, if you're having issues with composition teachers out there, I mean, clearly you haven't found the right one. I would suggest potentially either, if you can, looking into trying to join a conservatoire, or perhaps trying to find a composer who you do like and sending them your music and arranging some sort of deal where they help you to understand the process of musical creation. We are in a world now where you can just jump on Zoom or jump on Skype and just talk to people, and that's kind of all you need. You don't need to be in the same room as this person. Working with a composer who's a teacher isn't actually them taking a magnifying glass to all your harmonies and rhythms and assessing them, you know. That's technical stuff that you can do yourself. You learn that stuff as you go. It's more about the bigger stuff. It's, what was the structure you were after? Why does this just stop where it stops? Why didn't you develop this? Why are you doing this in the first place? And it just helps you to not only reflect on what you've made, but also just to figure out when it's time to stop and just move on to something else. It can only happen with someone who knows a little bit more about the art of teaching people music, and they need to be looking at music you've written and feeding back to you. So I would suggest, if you can find teachers locally, look globally and see if you can find someone who is perhaps doing doctorate or a professor, and ask them, would they mind doing calls with you? You know, and you have to share the music, and then they're going to give you feedback about that music, and they're going to set tasks. You just need someone to help oversee it with you. And it can be done with a light touch. It doesn't have to be daily lessons. It can be every fortnight, you know. So that's my recommendation. Just find someone. You need to find someone. That's my opinion. Gunnar, oh god, this is embarrassing. I can't say anyone's name. Gunnar Lias. I have no idea how to say your second name. I'm so sorry. Let's take your second name, pop it into, how do I pronounce this? How do I pronounce?
The following pronunciation is brought to you by pronouncenames.com.
Cool.
Lilia.
Lilia? That doesn't have an L in it. Yeah, Gunnar Lilia. Okay, I pronouncenames.com. You have an issue with the way I pronounce your name, you take it up with them. They told me your name is Gunnar Lilia, and I've probably mispronounced your first name as well. I'm so sorry. So Gunnar is asking my opinion on UX and UI of major operating systems, both on desktop and mobile platforms. Okay. I'll race through these. You know, I worked in Microsoft and I worked with Canonical on Ubuntu. I'm a Windows person. I grew up on Windows initially. I started on a Windows machine, and I still think that when it comes to the sort of file management stuff, finding your stuff in Windows at its core was just nicer and easier. However, as things progressed, Once you got into Windows, let's just skip Windows 8. Once you got to Windows 10, we're now in a situation where it's just endless bloat and weird stuff. Like, I don't know if they fixed it yet. In fact, the team I used to work for are the team responsible for this at the moment. But they tied, for example, the Cortana voice assistant to your search bar. So when you're searching something, Cortana keeps popping up all the time. Like, that was a decision that wasn't made by one person. This was a horrible deal forged between two completely different studios who are loosely connected by the fact that they both work for a company called Microsoft. And that would be the way I would describe Microsoft's operating system. It is a horrible result of endless haggling between studios who are all trying to get individual funding from the big people who sit right at the very top. I've seen it myself so many times, and that's why sometimes the most unbelievably strange or inconsistent behavior pops into Windows, and the weird bloat and the extra menus and stuff. Everyone's funded individually. They're all trying to make their own versions of what Windows should be. They all sort of get little bits of what they want, and they all have to sort of jank it all together, and it's a nightmare. And you get Cortana, that's also a search bar. That doesn't make sense. And if you've ever tried to add a skill to Cortana, it's just absolutely baffling. And I hate to admit it, but what they're planning on doing, in the future is also just a horrible process of negotiation that's just going to end horribly, unless there's a miracle. But I don't know. Microsoft is a frustrating company sometimes. It's very annoying to see the most talented people I think I've ever worked with forced to have to make nonsense all the time. Yeah, I don't know. I like when Microsoft operating system is really powerful. It's really good. It's just a shame, really. Apple, love the let's say the Mac OS. I love the way it's not changed that much. It's just been the same thing for a long time, and they just make little micro adjustments, and they don't bloat it up with lots of crap. It's just about as utilitarian as it needs to be, and I like that about it. I always have liked that about it. So anyway, so I love the Mac OS for desktop, but I do find the company at large quite frustrating because they do tend to just come up with tech for tech's sake and then make us foot the bill and then give us no other options. The laptops are just crazy expensive. They're insanity how expensive they are. And it just seems like they keep making new silly little widgets and things almost with the purpose of making it more expensive. And I don't see it as technology stepping forward. It's not stepping forward to keep making things more and more expensive all the time. Same with the iPhone. And I think they finally realized that they've gone about as far as they can go with pretty much making us foot the costs of their research and development by just shoving new cameras into things. Their interfaces are beautiful. The iOS is still the nicest phone operating system as far as I'm concerned in terms of just working the best. But then they're frustrating in so many other ways. And I'm going to get to that other way because there's another question coming up where I'm going to talk about my least favorite thing in an operating system. And I'm not going to spoil that yet. I'll get to that in a moment. Linux, I only have experience of Ubuntu. Ubuntu is fine. For free, it's great. It has its own little quirks. It is not quite hasn't got the level of polish that the other, the major platforms have. Worked on Ubuntu Mobile. That was a disaster. It's now no longer being supported properly. That was quite highly polished, but now is dead. Android is, obviously, it's allowed manufacturers to make very, very cheap handsets, and that was necessary in the world, and it's just a good that they've done that. But it's not as good as iOS, and the interaction models always frustrate me a little bit, but it's perfectly fine. It's serviceable. There's things I like about Android. I love the way it's configurable, by the way. So into that. I could go on at length about the different operating systems, but that's the my quick breakdown of what I think about the big operating systems that are out there. So some guy, what's your favorite album? And you ask, aside from "Sing to God" by the Cardiacs. By Cardiacs, I meant to say. Very, very sorry. My favorite album, "Sing to God" isn't my favorite Cardiacs album. I'll have you know, it's "The Seaside." I think "The Seaside" has more jams, although "Sing to God" has my favorite song, which is "Dirty Boy." It is close, though. I'll give you that. My favorite band is Mr. Bungle, and my favorite album is "California" by Mr. Bungle, which was their last album from 1999. It's always going to be the answer, I think. I just love that band. I love the way they ended on a high. At least it looks like they've ended on a high. They've now got back together to sort of do some silly re-release of an old demo they made years ago. But I think it's a pretty easy step from Cardiacs to Mr. Bungle, to be honest. Or in my case, it was from Mr. Bungle to Cardiacs. Jeremy Abel So Jeremy Abel wants to know, what is the largest difficulty I've encountered while working on MuseScore from a UX point of view, and what were my solutions? The hardest thing about MuseScore is the legacy that comes with hundreds of people all making a million different types of widgets and buttons and controls and individual solutions that are not necessarily planned or coordinated, and they've put them all into MuseScore over the years, and what we're left with is just in so many cases, I would call it a cacophony of interface. And the hardest part is trying to figure out what they all are, what problems they're trying to solve, especially because in some cases we can't actually ask the people who made them, and then trying to figure out what the best organization of all these ideas could be, and how we could rearrange the whole thing to make a more modern, more rational interface. There's a lot of things we want to put into MuseScore that we're blocked from doing because there's already too much stuff in there. So taking a step back and just doing a new architecture for MuseScore is what I'm doing right now, and it's the hardest thing. It's a lot easier to propose new things, but it's a lot harder to take what already exists and rebuilding it in a way that won't frustrate the people who've got used to it. So yeah, every time you change a button in an app, every time you make a button slightly less red than it was before, you are really annoying someone who is used to that red button being exactly that way. It's impossible not to frustrate people, and the real game behind the game with interface design is rearranging it in such a way that you annoy the fewest amount of people possible, and you need to do a lot of communication beforehand, I think, in order to make sure they know it's coming. And explaining why you've done it. If you can tell someone, I moved it over here, but I did it for a very good reason, that's going to go a long way, I think. A lot of companies don't actually do that. They just make the change and then they blam it out in people, and they have to come to terms with it and figure out what the hell is this all about. So yeah, that's it. That's my answer to that question. William Gall says, are you going to do more biographical videos on composers or artists? And are you going to do any more collaborations? Yes. Regarding the artists, I'm thinking of doing one about Lutosławski, who's a composer I really, really like. I'd also like to do something about the second Viennese school, probably Schoenberg in particular, maybe Webern too. I just think that those guys get a bit of a bad rap on the internet. A lot of people hate serialism, and I just find it very strange to hate serialism. I mean, I know that it has some proponents who are just infuriating, who have been incredibly, condescending towards other people in other areas of music. But I don't think that's something that means that serialism is automatically bad, and I'd just like to just sort of demystify it a little bit. There's some people out there who are doing that, but I feel it's something I'd like to take on, to be honest with you, just to go, hey, it's not actually that something to be frightened of, it's just a technique, So regarding collaborations, I'm doing more and more of those over time. So myself and David Bruce are always planning collaborations in the future. We would have released another 5 Composers video had it not been for the pandemic, which stopped us from going out to the performance and stopped the musicians from being able to assemble to play it. And Ben Levin, another person I'm in the middle of doing a collaboration with, again, slightly halted by the pandemic. And then my next video is about a collaboration I've done with another YouTuber, a fairly well-known one, on a video that he's made. And you'll see that pretty shortly. Next question is from Roman Gauthier. Probably pronounced that wrong. Our last au pair was called Roman, although she was a girl and I think you're a boy. But her name was spelled differently to yours, so I probably just messed it up. So Roman Gauthier's first question is, have I any more takedowns of Thoughty 2 planned for the future? No, definitely not. I don't look back on that video very fondly. There's a kind of a fine line about mocking and just pointing out where someone's wrong. And I think I went over that line a bit. I just feel like he's an easy target. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I think when someone is maybe a lot more militant and maybe abusive in their opinions, or is themselves abusing someone else, then maybe I think they're fair game. I do think that some people are certainly fair game, but I feel that in this case, it's just a kid who has no clue, and kind of replacing his head with a pint just feels a bit mean. And I don't think I'm going to do that again. I think I'm going to pick my targets a little bit more wisely in future, to be perfectly honest. If I'm going to target someone else again in the future, I want to target someone either with a bit more authority or someone who themselves is really brash and overbearing, so that they deserve it, quite frankly. I'm not certain this guy who just hasn't a clue deserves it. Deserves it a little bit, but not as much, I think, as I did. So Jezeps Germalovs asks, after I'm finished with notation software, do I plan on doing any reviews of DAWs like FL Studio or Logic or any of those? Not sure. Definitely not all of them. I mean, I don't think that the problem is, right, that these kind of reviews have a shelf life. There's a lot of funny stuff to be found and a lot of interesting things to talk about with notation programs. And I feel that with probably only a few left to talk through, I'm beginning to exhaust that kind of well. With DAWs, there's so many of them that there's definitely new things to talk about with those types of apps, but there's no reason to go through them all because it'll just end up being a review where you're not learning anything anymore. And that's where I draw the line with the video. There has to be a reason for the video to exist. And the notation program videos, they're not really about the programs, they're about the experience and they're about design. Once I get through with Finale, which is its own little beast and definitely has its own little place, there's going to be an interesting video about that one, no doubt. But after that, it'll begin becoming repetitive. I'll begin saying the same things all over again. It won't be as satisfying. It won't be as fresh. And with DAWs, I'll do one probably. I'm not certain which one. I have a feeling I might want to do Reaper, actually. But I'm definitely not going to do all of them because if it starts getting boring, there's just no point. I don't think seeing me regurgitate the same stuff about each one of the DAWs out there is particularly useful to you. It might be good for me in terms of numbers, but I just don't like doing that kind of stuff. I'd like to move on to something else, I think it's pretty likely I will do one, but not right away. And I don't think I'll work my way through all of them. I'm pretty certain I won't do that. Jezeps also asked, what other things am I going to work on? I want to do a video series about something called visual music, which is a very interesting little subgenre that kind of grew up in the late 20s, early 30s. When it was in its infancy, a lot of the creators came up with systems for how visuals could complement music. Very interesting, very esoteric. Everyone had their own little ideas. And it's an avenue of music's history that a lot of people don't know about. It's very hidden. And I want to talk about that a lot because I studied that in depth for quite a few years and did my master's thesis about it too. Another thing I'm going to be talking about a lot more is music that I'm writing or have written. Just do a straightforward video about how I wrote this music. And that's what the next video is going to be, and probably the video after that too. Leo Wattenberg asks, what's the most annoying design pattern on desktop apps right now? Okay, well, that's easy. For me, I guess it's not really a pattern, it's a tendency. But, okay, so Microsoft OneDrive, for example, if you try to close OneDrive on a Windows machine, and this is something I suffered with every morning in Microsoft for 5 years, you try to right-click on the system tray to close it, right? And then you go exit or something like that, or close. And then it brings up the full interface and it then auto-clicks another menu for you and shows you a new menu, which basically means you have to do it a second time. And they introduced that deliberately to make it more difficult to close it because they really want it open, because they really want you to use OneDrive. They want you to invest in their cloud services. And I hate that kind of deliberate friction that they put in your way, deliberate annoyance to just make you go, oh, you know what? I'll use your OneDrive. But Apple take the absolute biscuit with this, with iCloud. iCloud is just utter garbage. It is just terrible, a terrible service. If you've ever actually logged on to the web interface of iCloud, it's actually flabbergasting how terrible it is. So anyway, what Apple do to get you to use iCloud is they keep showing you these warning messages, which aren't warning messages. One that pops up all the time on my iPhone now is, your iPhone is not backed up. And it's like, oh dear, and it's got this exclamation mark, which makes me think, what have I done wrong now? But you haven't done anything wrong. It's just an ad going, use iCloud, back up, use our iCloud, use it, please. But it's just framed as an error message, like something's gone wrong. And each time I see it, I get a little panicky feeling. And on my desktop now, they've started doing that too. I think it's something, what they say is like, you've not been backed up. It's just deliberate misuse of a pattern. In both cases. In one, it's just making it more hard to close something, where they did make it easy in the past. And another one is just a notification to frighten you into using a service that you do not and have said multiple times you don't want to use. I'm going to absolutely kill Apple one day on iCloud and everything to do with iCloud when I start a design channel, which I am going to start at some point probably soon. They're going to be small little videos, and one of the first ones is going to be me killing iCloud. I'm going to tear it to shreds, honestly. It's so obnoxious for a company that charges so much money. Jude Lovelace asked, how do I deal with artist's block or writer's block? Well, I try to stay active would be the answer. Shostakovich has a quote, which I always liked, which was, no matter what you do, make sure you write at least one note of music every day. Can't say that I write one note of music every day, but it's true that I'm generally manipulating or working with some piece of music in some way. It might even be just producing it or fixing up the mixing or something. But just keep your head in the game all the time. I would say that one of the things you should not do is write a bit of music on the weekend, do your full week, and then on a Sunday afternoon kind of creep back into your studio and kind of do another little bit of music, because then it becomes a chore and you have to gear yourself up to do it. Find a way to make it so that you're at least doing a little bit every day, and then it just becomes natural and actually your body stops resisting it as much. I find that there's actually a physical resistance that comes when you don't do music regularly. Your body just doesn't want to go there because it's actually quite tough. Another thing, this is more for people who are beginners, and I'm not certain if you are in particular, don't allow yourself to stay working on the same thing over and over and over again. Don't keep returning to the same piece of music if it's not going anywhere or if it's not progressing, especially if you're listening to the same loop over and over again on some DAW that you've put together that you really like, but you've no idea where it should go. When that happens, just trust me, put it aside, start something else, work on that instead, and then come back to that other piece of music and ask yourself, what can be done here? And disable the loop and start writing some new music. Do not keep listening back over and over again to music that you've written. This is a trap I used to fall into all the time. So it's a mixture of deliberately force yourself to be reflective by not listening to stuff all the time. Deliberately force yourself to be reflective by trying out new ideas and writing new things, put them in a drawer, and then trying more things out, and then keep returning back to your music, and it'll become more obvious to you what is and what isn't working. And definitely don't keep listening to music over and over again that you've written where you just don't know what to do. So Cody asks, do you think the fugue style can transcend genres? I'm not certain if you're trolling me with this question. So fugues, contrapuntal fugue, organization of material it can transcend any genre. It's not specific to, it's common in classical music or Baroque music, but yeah, it can be used anywhere. Why not? And it doesn't have to be just the only style you use or the only system of organization you use in a piece of music. You can use all kinds of things. So it can transcend all existing genres and become its own and inform a new one. Maybe there could be a new genre called fugue. I don't know. Anyway, yeah, that's my answer to that question. Gunnar Lilia again. This is an older question you asked. Do I have any experience of so-called epic music? Yeah, I quickly typed epic music into Google and I saw a lot of playlists that were very long, and it just sounds like movie trailer music. Hold on. Why are people into this stuff? I don't get it. I'm going to go to the shop and I'm going to put on the most epic music. I'm going to buy some cigarettes. All right, anyway. Emmanuel Stauffer asks, what do you think should be prioritized when teaching music, either theory, composition, or an instrument? It depends on the student and what the student is after. It depends on where the student is in their learning. Are they just beginning? Is it like a kid? In which case you probably want to just chuck all kinds of things at them and let them sort of find their own way. A nice balance of theory and practical stuff and composition if they're interested in composition, and technique to do with their instruments. It's I don't even think there's a particular right order of things. It's really down to the student. What is the student interested in, and what are the qualities that the teacher has? A good teacher can make anything interesting. And a good teacher will know what is something you need to teach right now and what's something we can save for later. I would say that a lot of musicians don't study composition. A lot of players in the classical world have never studied composition and don't really know very much about it or conducting, it's not necessary that they do. So Julian Bruckner asks, in Germany, there is an academic distinction between serious music and entertainment music. The first one usually being classical music and parts of jazz, and the other ones being basically everything else. What's your opinion of this? Is it just an outdated historical artifact? Or does fundamental differences between classical and non-classical exist? It's impossible to really answer that in properly. I mean, there are people out there who are conceited and who think that classical music is a relic that only belongs to smart people who know about classical music, and everything else is just a bit dumb. And they feel that way towards jazz as well, a lot of people who I know at least. I think from a structural point of view, there's a lot to be said for the difference between the history of classical music and the history of a lot of music, especially that's rooted in the pop song. But it's more just a structural difference, you know. The way things develop in classical music is a bit different. Classical music seems to follow its own history a little bit differently, and pop music seems to have its own history, and they're different things. Whether one is serious and the other isn't serious is just clearly not true, because for every single, no matter how much you try to refine the description of classical music to make it sound serious, you've all kinds of classical music that isn't particularly serious, and you also have lots of pop music or rock music or jazz that's super serious, where, you know, maybe in many cases it transcends the genre, or it's not a clear example of what the typical genre is. If you put your heart and soul into it, if you make it your day job, if you craft it as carefully as you possibly can, you're putting serious effort into it. It doesn't even matter what the result is at the end of it. So in that respect, it's ridiculous to suggest that one is serious and the other isn't. One is not just something you just fling out the door and it just happens. I mean, I think the biggest difference that I can see in someone who thinks in a classical way, or like a way that I would call in the tradition of classical music, and someone who thinks in the tradition of whatever genre they're writing for, is I find that genre music very much feels the need to retain the trappings of its genre, whereas with classical music, today especially, you get just everything. A composer basically goes, I want some instruments here, I want such and such a length, and I'm just going to write whatever. And you'll just come across any combinations of audio and visuals and musicians, and it could be electronic, or it might be electroacoustic, or it might not be. And that sort of freedom, and the freedom to just pursue an idea and take it and run with it and develop it, definitely feels more in the realm of the classical music, let's say, history tradition, than it does, let's say, in the rock tradition, which is by its very nature shorter form, often reflective of the history of rock and roll. But even as I say that, there are loads of examples of bands who don't do that and who don't think like that, and who step outside their genre, and who would make a fool of the suggestion that this is only something that classical music does. I think anyone being serious about developing themselves as a musician would do very well to investigate the history of classical music, or at least the history of modern classical music. There's no harm, you know, you'll just learn stuff. However, see no need to wade into the discussion about whether one is serious and the other isn't. It's just not true. So listen, thanks very much again for being a patron and for putting your faith in me to make good stuff, and I hope I'll satisfy you in the future. Thanks very much to everyone who's submitted questions. I'll do more again in the future, and there's going to be a lot more sort of behind the scenes stuff coming at you quite soon, so watch out for that. But anyway, have a nice time. I hope your pandemic is going okay. Mine is pretty crap. Let's hope it's all over soon. Take care. I'm on a swivel chair, by the way. That's why I'm able to do this. Ow.